About 3 months ago, a friend of mine, Albert Rodriguez, sent me a link to a website that explains a whole lot about the reason life is the way it is today. It explains this economic roller coaster that we've been on with bubbles and busts. It explains the income inequality and wealth disparity. It explains why some people have become wealthy, and some of them fairly easily, and while others seem to struggle to get ahead. They just, no matter what they do, they can't get ahead. And I've had that tab open on my browser now for 3 months, meaning to make a video out of it, and today I'm going to do it. So this explains a lot of the reason your life is the way it is. And by knowing this, again, it will help you to see the future. The website is WTFHappenedIn1971.com. So, what did happen in 1971? Well, on August 15th of 1971, President Nixon went on TV and said, "Today I have directed Secretary Connally to temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold." Temporarily. Milton Friedman once said, "There is nothing so permanent as a temporary government program." Now, so that was the day that August 15th of 71, we severed the final link between our currency and money. We used to have money, gold, real gold, backing our currency that we use as the medium of exchange, and they were fully convertible back and forth. The convertibility, the dollar used to be 100% backed before the Federal Reserve, and then it was 40% backed from the Federal Reserve until 1944 when we started the Bretton Woods system, and from then on there was no specified backing, no reserve ratio, and it fell to about 8% when Nixon finally abolished the Bretton Woods system and took the entire world off of the gold standard because all of the other world's currencies were pegged to the US dollar and the dollar was pegged to gold. So, WTF happened in 1971? Well, when we severed the tie between real money and fiat currency, the fiat currency that is in our wallets. None of it, no country on earth uses money. They all use national fiat currencies, and national fiat currencies leak. They bleed value. And so what we see here is this is growth in productivity and hourly compensation since 1948. And they used to grow together. Second, we went off of precious metals. It doesn't matter whether it's precious metals. It could be anything that is a fixed currency supply that the powers that be cannot manipulate, where it's nature dictating the rules, not the Federal Reserve, the world's central banks, the government, and so on. And so what has happened since 71 is compensation went flat and has grown just a little bit, 115%, productivity 246%, so it hasn't kept up. Real GDP, real wages, and trade policies, I don't know where trade policies come into this next chart, but from 1947 to 2014, 1947 equals 100. So what they've done here is they've indexed all of these different things together at 100, and this is the percent change. So this is a 50% growth, a 200% growth, and this is real GDP per capita, so GDP per person. Real GDP per FTE, and that is full-time equivalent worker. Average real wage using the GDP as the deflator. Average real wage using the consumer price index as the deflator. And real median weekly earnings of full-time workers using the CPI as a deflator. I would think when they say full-time workers here, they're stripping out anybody in supervisory positions, management positions, and so on, which would be included in this group. And this is also average, whereas this is median. So that's one of the reasons. But what you see here is this tremendous divergence between wages and GDP, and it all happened when we severed the tie between money and currency. Income gains widely shared in early post-war decades, but not since then. This is real family income between 1947 and 2016 as a percentage of the 1973 level. So what they've done is they've indexed all of this to 1973 at a value of 100. And so these are the gains measured as a percent, with 100% being the income in 1973. And in 1971, it was the end of 71, remember, August 15th, we severed that tie. And if you're in the upper 5% of income earners, you've made gains since 73. Your life is about 75% better than it was. Your prosperity, your level of the stuff you can own and so on is 75% better than it was in 73. For the bottom 20%, they're only about 5% better off than they were in 1973. Consumer Price Index. I published this exact graph in my book. And what's interesting, here's the beginning of the Federal Reserve. This is the end of the Bretton Woods system. So when we severed the link between money and currency. But what you have here is inflations and deflations, and the inflations are always leading up to war. And then you've got deflations, inflations and deflations. The creation of the Federal Reserve just in time for World War I, so they inflated the currency supply big time. Then we had a deflation and the Roaring '20s, and then another deflation called the Great Depression that we couldn't get out of. Now, there's a reason this is called the Great Depression and not just the Depression. The reason it was called the Great Depression is because there were other depressions before that. There was something called the Long Depression. There was another depression in here. I can't remember the names of the different depressions, but there was the Long Depression and there were a couple of other depressions. And what happens is eventually we come out of them. Without government intervention, without the Federal Reserve, we come out of the Depression, and they were not nearly as bad as the Great Depression, which was the worst of all of the depressions that we had been to, where the government did come in and try and save us, and the Federal Reserve was established, and they were using monetary policy tools to try and get us out of it, and they only made things worse. It was going into World War II, and it was actually not the spending on war, where you're spending a bunch of time, energy, and deficit spending, which is dilution of the purchasing power of the public's currency supply, stealing currency away from them so that you can build things that are going to blow up other true wealth, destroy buildings and factories and true wealth. So that's war. It wasn't the spending on the war, but during these periods of time, the gold stocks in the United States, we exported, once the young men that were on all of the farms in Europe, all over the world, anybody involved in World War I, they take all their young men off the farms and turn them into soldiers. They imported all of their grains from the United States, and they imported all their consumer goods from the United States. And our gold stocks went up 70% here. And in the run-up to World War II, they went up another 117%, I believe it was, on top of that 70%. By the time World War II ended, the U.S. owned 2/3 of all the world's monetary gold. 2/3. This is part of what made us a superpower. Also, the shift from the Bank of England being the hub of the classical gold standard to the Bank of England and the United States being the clearinghouse for the international gold standard. And then England left that in 1931, and it was just the United States was the clearinghouse for all of the international payments and so on. It all went through this is what really made us into a superpower. It isn't that we're better than everybody else. It isn't that we're more efficient than everybody else. It's a combination of laws, not having war on our soil, so none of our true wealth was blown up. And it wasn't all of the it was partially people going back to work, but it wasn't the deficit spending that we were using to confiscate the wealth of the citizens so that we could blow up true wealth. But here we end the last tie. Remember, back here we've got full backing of the currency with precious metals. Here we've got 40% backing. After World War II, we had an unspecified backing that fell to just 8% by the time Nixon took us off of money and we were on purely fiat currency, and this just exploded. I can't imagine the level of prosperity that we would be at had this not happened. This is Boston, New York and Boston, and it's the median house price and the median household income. So the red and gray is the income, the blue and yellow is the house prices. And here they are back in 1960, they're all indexed together. So this is the percentage change. And what you see is after 71, they start to diverge and go haywire. And here we have the price of the homes and the income. And so the home affordability is far, far less. There's a piece on this, I believe, in episode 7 of Hidden Secrets of Money. I show my father, who was managing a auto parts store, it was a performance equipment store and auto parts store in Salem, Oregon, and his income was like $9,000 something. I show his tax return that year. But then I went to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or maybe it was the census. I went to the U.S. Census website, and he was making as much as a median price single-family home in Oregon. So his annual wage as a manager of an auto parts store was enough to, in 1 year, be able to buy a house. So that has changed, and part of it is severing the tie between money and currency and going with the currency. This is inflation, but it's the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers. So this is for people living in the cities. This is what the government says that our cost of living is, how it's rising. However, if you go to school or have children, so this is tuition, other school fees, and childcare, then this is your inflation. If you get sick, this is your inflation. So this is the inflation of healthcare. And suspension of the gold standard, once Nixon did that, it was all over with for all of these things. The things you need are getting more expensive. The things that you don't need are getting less expensive. We're going into this deflationary period right now. But as you've seen in some of my other videos, the cost of food is going to be going up because of supply chain disruptions. These are episodes of hyperinflation, and it shows all of these episodes, and what they're trying to show here is that there weren't any in this Bretton Woods section, and after, except for this one here in Chile, I think that is. So August 15th of 71 would be somewhere around here. But what you see here, the hyperinflations usually are connected with war or some other huge disaster or conflict. And what we have here is World War I and right afterwards. What's interesting about this period, and when you look at this where it says Europe, you've got Austria, you've got Germany and here, but most of the countries here are they're Eastern Bloc countries. We didn't have the Eastern Bloc after World War I. But when they list Europe, they're not listing all of Europe, they're not listing all of Asia, Latin America, or Africa. These are just countries that have experienced hyperinflation. And since we're talking about World War I here, and the hyperinflations in Germany, this is where it took weeks for prices to double. This is where it took days, and the red ones is where it took hours for prices to double. I'm going to veer off on a little sidetrack here. And Milton Friedman, from his book, A Monetary History of the United States, 1867 to 1960, quite a masterpiece. I took a bunch of quotes out of it when I read it. Throughout most of the world, for the victors, vanquished, and neutral alike, I just love the way he writes, prices rose sharply before or into 1920 and fell sharply thereafter. So right after World War I ended, prices rose and then fell. About the only countries that were to avoid the price decline were those that were to experience hyperinflation. And so what you're seeing are the few countries, all of the other countries, almost all of them, went into this big deflation. In the United States, I called it, when I wrote my book, the Depression of 1921. And then later on, other people started calling it the Depression of 1921. Jim Grant wrote a book called The Forgotten Depression. The reason it was forgotten is because the government didn't rush in to save us. Neither did the Federal Reserve. They allowed the free market to work. It was actually a much greater price contraction. The wholesale prices contracted twice as bad as the Great Depression. So it was a very, very severe contraction, but the free market healed it. And it healed it so quickly that it became the Forgotten Depression. This is World War II. I wrote a chapter that got cut out of my first book about the Hungarian hyperinflation. And what you see here, though, is this big band of hyperinflations. This is the USSR collapsing, and almost all of these in this 1991-1992 period, almost all of these countries are connected with the USSR back then. So, but obviously not Africa and Latin America. So it's very interesting. There's Zimbabwe, and here's Venezuela today. All major currencies have declined over the past century relative to gold. We've shown this chart in the past. I think this was in my book. There's an anomaly in here. These were pegged to gold. So this this is purple, the yen, Japanese yen. I don't think that it increased against gold if it was being backed by gold. But what you see here is the mark. And what they don't show is that after the mark completely collapsed in 1923, they came out with the Renton mark, which just went to zero within a matter of months. And then here is the Reichsmark, and that went to zero during World War II. And then here's the Deutschmark, which is then spliced to the euro. The US is the blue one here. So this is where gold in 1934, gold's price went from $20.67 an ounce to $35 an ounce. In other words, instead of requiring only $20.67 to buy an ounce of gold, it now took $35 more dollars to buy an ounce of gold. It was the dollar going down, not gold going up. And then this is during the period of the London gold pool. You'll have to, maybe I'll make a video on that later. I can't explain it right now. This video will become too long. But then gold became free trading, and we've gone from the dollar being worth 1/20th of an ounce of gold to being worth 1/1700th of an ounce of gold. That's the dollar falling, not necessarily gold going up. We've got income growth from 1917 through 2012, and you have here the top 1% and the bottom 90%. So the income growth in different time periods. Now, it's not good for the bottom 90% to just be expanding their income, and the rich. During this period here in the 50s, there was the top tax bracket was 94%. You got to, if you made enough, you got to keep 6 pennies for every dollar that you made. And so what happened during this time period is productive individuals that own businesses and hire people, create jobs, create prosperity. They spend all their time looking for some tax loopholes, trying to figure out how to keep the government from stealing 94% of what they earn. It was just absolutely insane. And so, I'll show you something probably in the next special report that'll go more in depth on this. I don't have time to show it to you here. But Nixon suspends the gold standard. The bottom 90%ers stop getting more of the income growth, and it's the top 1% that start in 1982, and this is when the stock market started its boom. And it's interesting, this goes up and down with the value of the stock market, which is very similar to the financialization of government chart that I showed you, and so on. Number of countries with banking crises, so this is the number, and this is during the interwar Bretton Woods period. However, these aren't caused because of the different gold standards. They're caused because of World War II and World War I. But since we left that, look at this. This is crazy. So this only goes to the year 2000. If we had 2008 in here, it would be somewhere up here. And so 2000, maybe this is 2008. I don't know. This would be the year 2000, it looks like. And that would go along with the crash of the NASDAQ and so on. So the banking crisis, this might be 2000, and that's 2001, as stock markets around the world were crashing as the tech bubble popped. Income inequality in the U.S. The Federal Reserve established Bretton Woods and the gold standard, but this was also a gold standard, and there was a gold standard before that. The best one was this one. This one's 40% reserve. This one starts with a 40% coupling to gold for the dollar and falls to 8%. And then we sever the tie between gold and the dollar, and income inequality increases. This is basically different ways of looking at the same thing. This is the top decile, so the top 10%. This is the top 1%, the top 5%, the income share of the top 1% relative to the bottom 90%. So it's all basically the same thing. This is another way of viewing the same thing. This is the bottom 90% and the top 1%'s share of the national income, the U.S. wealth. And so 71 is where we went off of gold. Now, I'll show you in another presentation sometime. This is part of what I call it the income distribution cycle. And if you go to episode 7 of Hidden Secrets of Money, you'll see that I've got anecdotal data before this, that there was an income distribution cycle, and it peaked, and it went back down, peaked again, and it's probably going to head back down in this next cycle. And as we go, as there's a backlash toward capitalism, because we've had manipulated market cronyism, not free market capitalism, but capitalism will get blamed, and the free markets will get blamed, which is a tragedy, because that is where all prosperity comes from. And they'll get blamed, and so we'll go more socialistic. And so this will reverse, and we'll see this cycle repeat. Federal debt held by the public. Now, this held by the public, I'm going to go much more in-depth in that in a separate video. I tried to couple it to this video, but it would have made this video last for an hour. Federal debt held by the public. So this is the amount of the federal debt that's held by the public, and I believe this is as a percentage of GDP. And what you see is after the Revolutionary War, we ended up with debt that was about 30% of GDP, and we grew the economy faster than the government could spend the national income. So the government was, during this whole time, for most of the time that governments exist, they always increase their spending. They never stop increasing their spending. What happens is there are periods of time where the economy grows faster than they increase their spending, but they almost never cut spending. And then right in here, Andrew Jackson was president, and we had the first Bank of the United States back in here, and its charter ended, and so this was the first central bank of the United States. And then we had the second Bank of the United States, and its charter was coming due, and as you saw in that quote from, I think, 2 videos ago, or maybe it was just the last video, Maybe it was 3 videos ago, but Andrew Jackson basically said that they were a den of vipers and thieves, and he would rout them out. And basically, he swore to kill the bank, and he did. And we paid down the national debt. There's probably a tiny surplus in here. So this is the last time that the United States had a savings account, something for a rainy day. And you know what? In just the past couple of months, it started a downpour. We're in the middle of a giant pandemic hurricane, and we have no savings. We've spent ourselves into a pit. But then we grew the national debt. Then the Civil War grew the national debt hugely. So we're up at about 35% or so. Now this is the biggest war in U.S. history, measured as a percentage of GDP, measured as a percentage of the U.S. population killed. This is the bloodiest war we've ever fought. Then we established the Federal Reserve. It funded World War I. Then here we have the Roaring '20s. And so we're growing the economy faster than the politicians can spend it. Then we go into the Great Depression. And this is not us borrowing more and spending more. This is GDP shrinking. So the debt becomes a larger percentage of the size of the economy because the economy got so much smaller. Then this is deficit spending for World War II. Then we grow the economy a lot faster than the politicians can spend it. And we get back down to the same levels of the debt that was left over of the Revolutionary War, and we didn't continue. This is, it goes on and on and on. But right now it's saying that we're here. Now, this is federal debt held by the public. If you just take gross federal debt, this level is actually way up here. It's very close to that, and I'll show you that in an upcoming video. And then this is what's projected, and this is probably, yes, a CBO projection, Congressional Budget Office, projecting where this is going in the future. So the guys that make the plans on how much we're going to spend, they're making this as their projection. This is the end game to this. This is bad. This is basically a close-up of this area of this chart. So just World War II to that dashed line. Actually, this gets updated a little. This goes out, looks like it goes to about 2019. It's gone up a little bit since this. I just checked it. So we went off of using money to back our currency where there was a link between the two, and that's when things went haywire. This is all sectors, debt, securities, and loans. This includes private and corporate liability level, and compared to the GDP of the country. So this is the economy. This is all the debt that we've taken on as a society. And this is over a year old. It's up at 77 trillion today. U.S. national debt, we're getting close to the end of this, from 1900 to 2020. And so it just goes to the beginning of 2020. And this doesn't even fit on my screen. But what we see here, World War I, the Roaring '20s, Great Depression, World War II, and notice there's only a couple of years in here. There's a couple of times where this actually goes down, but it goes up in all years, including the supposed Clinton surplus years right here. There's 4 years where this should be going. If the surpluses during the Clinton years are true, if you're in debt, but you have a couple of years where your income is greater than your expenditures, where you spend less than your income, the difference would reduce the debt. And this doesn't go down, it goes up. And it shows that there's a bunch of smoke and mirrors accounting going on. I've identified some of the smoke and mirrors accounting. And here is federal surplus or deficit as a percentage of gross domestic product. This is that lie that I'm talking about. These may be real. They weren't doing as much smoke and mirrors back then. This is the same chart again, presented in a different way. Federal surplus or deficit. It's not as a percentage of GDP, but there were 1, 2, 3, 4 years. Each one of these bends here is a data point. And so that 4 years, that was all below this zero line. This chart is a lie. When you add it all up, it's more than a 7. If you add up the national debt and you go back right to the beginning here and you add up every surplus and deficit together, there's more than a $7 trillion, it's almost an $8 trillion discrepancy. Personal savings rate. So now we're getting into a little bit more of the social implications too, not just economics. But we had a savings rate, and this has nothing to do with GDP, okay. A savings rate of greater than 10%. And when I was a kid, this was just standard. Everybody would save 10% of their income, and you'd put it away in a savings account, which used to pay enough interest to where you could retire and expect to live off of the interest from the savings that you had earned. You didn't invest in risky things. You put it into a savings account. And then that fell throughout the boom of the 1980s and 90s. And then once we got into this, the 2016, 2004. Yeah, so 2008 is about here. And it went up again as people get scared and down. Now, if you measure it as a percent of gross national income, you see this 10% area, but it actually went negative during the crisis of 2008. And right now, I am absolutely certain the data isn't in yet, but you just know that all of these people that are unemployed with the collapse of all the customers, there's anybody that's an entrepreneur, there's nobody in their stores. They're spending their savings right now. So this is minus, and it's already minus a lot more than the 2.5 or say 2.6% of the 2008 minimum here. This is probably already exceeding 5, and it's going to wipe out a whole lot of savings that people had built up over these time periods. The trade balance of trade in the United States. We supplied the world with food and merchandise and services. We were the world's economic engine. We used to be in the position that China has been for the last few decades. That was the U.S. until 1971. And right there where we separated currency from money and we started using currency, and money was just this oddity, this barbaric relic, as Keynes called it. Once that happened, we had 1 year with a surplus, but other than that, it's all down. Because why not? I mean, if the world is using your currency as the reserve currency and you have the ability to type digits and buy real stuff with it, why wouldn't you use it? However, that all stores up energy that's going to be coming back to haunt us today. This is negative energy. The balance of trade again repeated. This is interesting. The cost of a barrel of oil in nominal terms. So this is just in price. And you can see that when we were coupled to gold, it held this in check and kept things in balance. And once we severed that tie, this is right here, 1971, things went crazy. They not only went crazy to the upside, but they've gone crazy down to the deflationary side, where people were being paid $40 a barrel. So this chart is updated recently. $40 a barrel to take oil away. And then we get to something, interest rates since 3000 BC. And what you see is there's a natural sort of rate of interest. And so you've got short-term rates and long-term rates. The Federal Reserve was established right in here, and things were very smooth. Also, notice that there's sort of a cycle going on here, this dip and bump. They've gotten a little closer together since the Federal Reserve was established right about there, and that is the point where interest rates started going to the lowest in history. Look at these short-term rates, and the highest in history. This has never had these wild, out-of-control swings, never happened before the Federal Reserve in all of human history. Now, I'm going to take a little side detour here and take you to a chart that I created for a presentation a long time ago. I updated it for the early warning presentation. That's this chart, which would have been done in July of 2018. So it's a little bit old data. But if you remember, there was a cycle going on here, and if you go to the minimum here and the minimum here, so the lowest points of the interest rate, the number of months there and here is almost identical, and you can pretty much balance that arrow on top of it. So the same amount of years for a rise as the decline. And so if you did that same thing using this minimum and then that arrow and drop that, sometime between 2021 and 2023, interest rates should bottom and reverse. Now, these interest rates have continued to decline we're in territory where, we're here at the very beginning of 2020, and we're way, way down here. This is long-term interest rates, so it's the 30-year, but still, it's in insane areas. And it's going to reverse sometime. I'm going to have a separate video on that because this has really big consequences for all of us in the future. So look for the next special report to go over all of that. Getting back to WTF happened in 1971. This is just the 10-year bond yields for a bunch of different countries, and they were highly synchronized before 71 and then sort of went crazy after. They've become quite synchronized again, but they've gone into negative territory. Wow. How is it possible? This is not economically possible for it to go into negative territory unless you have Keynesian economists running the world's central banks. It's just not possible that you're going to loan. Somebody says, loan me some currency. I need some currency. I've been spending more than my income, and I need a little bit more because I'm still spending more than my income. Now, you're going to charge, if you loan them something and take that risk that you might not be paid back, typically you're going to say, well, there's a risk here. I need some sort of compensation. I'm going to charge you 10%. So I'll loan you $1 million, but you're going to have to pay me back $1.1 million. Well, here, the government is saying, you loan me $1 million and I'll only charge you $1.1 million. Loan me $1.1 million, I'll pay you back $1 million in 10 years. This isn't possible in economics, except in the crazy world we live in, led by these Keynesian central bankers. It's totally insane. Now we're getting really into the social implications. Incarceration rate, so this is inmates per 100,000 population. You can see when we went off of the Bretton Woods system that regardless of which one's male and which one's female, it exploded. And so there's something socially significant about using fiat currency, making it difficult for people to plan for the future, making it difficult for a whole class of people to get ahead. It leads to more crime, and this is just horrible to see. And then we've got 25 to 29-year-olds living with their parents or grandparents, and it had fallen down into the 70s, and as soon as we separated money from our currency, it exploded again. And that is because it's so hard to get ahead, so hard to get by, especially if you're starting out. Then we've got divorce, and this is the last chart. So this is just, there's 1971. The only comment I want to make on this is it's very interesting that the 18 to 34 years olds have this lowest divorce rate. And as you get older, it is higher. This is very interesting. And then I was thinking, well, maybe it's just because these people can't yet afford the divorce attorney. When they get to this age, they'll get divorced. I want to thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.